The sun blazed over Babylon, painting the city's mud-brick walls in molten gold. From the highest terrace of the royal palace, the world seemed to stretch endlessly, a patchwork of gardens, temples, and bustling markets, all pulsing with the life of a city at the heart of an empire. It was here, in the spring of 323 BCE, that Alexander the Great stood at the very summit of human ambition. He was 32 years old, but his legend already belonged to the ages. Son of Philip, king of Macedon, and Olympias, a queen who whispered to snakes and claimed descent from Achilles, student of Aristotle, breaker of the Persian Empire, pharaoh of Egypt, and self-proclaimed son of Zeus. Alexander's name was spoken in awe and fear from the marble columns of Athens to the distant, mist-shrouded valleys of India. What does it mean to stand at the top of the world? What shadows gather when a mortal dares to call himself a god? The palace at Babylon was a marvel, a city within a city. Its walls soared above the Euphrates, adorned with blue-glazed tiles and images of lions, dragons, and bulls. In the cool shade of its gardens, rare flowers bloomed beside fountains that sang with the laughter of courtiers and the splash of peacocks. The air was thick with the scent of myrrh and the low hum of intrigue. Here Alexander held court, a dazzling, dangerous theatre where the world's most powerful men and women vied for his favour. Generals who had marched with him from Macedon, their armour battered and eyes hard with ambition. Persian nobles, resplendent in silk and gold, who had bent the knee but not their pride. Greek philosophers, Egyptian priests, Indian sages, all drawn to the magnetic force of the Conqueror. Yet beneath the glittering surface, tension simmered. Old rivalries flared in the shadows. The Macedonian veterans grumbled at the presence of Persian satraps. The Persians, in turn, watched the king's every move, wary of his unpredictable moods. Even Alexander's closest companions, Ptolemy, Seleucus, the memory of Hephaestion, were caught in a web of loyalty and suspicion. All knew that the king's favour could make or break a man, and that the future of the empire depended on the health and will of a single extraordinary individual. To his followers, Alexander was more than a king. He was a living myth, a man touched by the divine. He had tamed Bucephalus, the wild stallion no other could ride. He had cut the Gordian knot, defying prophecy and fate. He had wept at the edge of the known world, lamenting that there were no more lands to conquer. But the man himself was a study in contradictions. He could be generous to a fault, lavishing gifts on friends and enemies alike. Yet his wrath was legendary, swift, merciless, and often unpredictable. He drank deeply, feasted lavishly, and demanded the same from those around him. He spoke of unity, of blending Greek and Persian, East and West, into a single immortal people. But his methods were often brutal, his vision enforced at the point of a sword. Those who knew him best saw the toll his conquests had taken, the lines etched into his face, the haunted look in his eyes when he remembered fallen friends, the scars, some visible, some hidden, left by years of war and betrayal. And now in Babylon, as the empire basked in the afterglow of victory, Alexander's thoughts turned restlessly to the future. The city buzzed with rumors of new campaigns. Arabia, the fabled land of incense and gold, beckoned from the south. Alexander spoke of building a fleet, of founding new cities, of reaching the ends of the earth. His ambition was boundless, his energy inexhaustible, or so it seemed. But there were other, darker currents at work. Omens and portents haunted the court. A lion cub was born with 2 heads. The temple of Bel was struck by lightning. Priests muttered of prophecies unfulfilled, of gods angered by mortal hubris. Alexander himself seemed increasingly obsessed with his own divinity. He demanded that his subjects prostrate themselves before him, as they would before a god. He sent envoys to the oracle at Siwa, seeking confirmation of his divine parentage. He surrounded himself with symbols of power, Persian robes, Egyptian crowns, the diadem of a king who would be a god. What drove a man to reach so high? Was it destiny, or desperation? Did Alexander truly believe he was more than mortal, or was he haunted by the knowledge that all empires and all men must one day fall? Beneath the surface, the empire Alexander had forged was a mosaic of peoples, languages, and loyalties. Macedonians, Greeks, Persians, Egyptians, Bactrians, Indians, all bound together by the will of one man. But unity was fragile, and the cracks were beginning to show. The Macedonian veterans resented the king's adoption of Persian customs. The Persians chafed under Macedonian rule. The Greeks, proud of their democracy and philosophy, looked askance at the growing cult of personality around Alexander. Even within the royal family, rivalries festered. Roxana, the beautiful and ambitious Persian queen, eyed her rivals warily. Olympias, Alexander's formidable mother, sent letters from Macedon, reminding her son of his roots and her own power. In the great halls of Babylon, alliances shifted like desert sands. Every gesture, every word was weighed and measured. The king's favor could make or break a man, and all knew that the future of the empire depended on the health and will of a single extraordinary individual. As the days grew longer and the heat pressed down on Babylon, a sense of unease settled over the city. The king, some whispered, was not himself. He brooded in private, his temper flaring without warning. He spoke of omens, of dreams filled with blood and fire. He pushed his men to prepare for new campaigns, even as many longed for peace. And then, in the midst of this uneasy calm, came the first signs of illness. A fever, a pain in the side, a sudden weakness. At first it was dismissed, a passing ailment, the result of too much wine, or the relentless Babylonian sun. But as the days passed, concern grew. Could the conqueror of worlds be brought low by something as simple as a fever? Or was there something more at work, an enemy in the shadows, a poison in the cup, a curse from the gods? In the twilight of his triumph, Alexander stood on the edge of the unknown. The empire he had built was vast, but its foundations were uncertain. The men and women who surrounded him were loyal, but also ambitious, each with their own dreams of power. The gods he invoked were silent, their will inscrutable. As the sun set over Babylon, casting long shadows across the palace walls, the world held its breath. In the heart of the greatest empire the world had ever known, the seeds of mystery and tragedy were already taking root. The city of Babylon shimmered beneath the relentless sun, its ziggurats and palaces rising from the plain like the bones of ancient gods. In the spring of 323 BCE, the city was swollen with the spoils of conquest and the restless energy of an empire stretched to its breaking point. Here, in the heart of Mesopotamia, Alexander the Great King, conqueror and self-proclaimed son of Zeus, prepared to chart the next chapter of his legend. Imagine the palace, a labyrinth of marble halls and perfumed courtyards, echoing with the footsteps of soldiers, courtiers and spies. The air was thick with incense and the low murmur of intrigue. In the great audience chamber, golden lions guarded the throne, and the walls were painted with scenes of Alexander's victories, Issus, Gaugamela, the burning of Persepolis. Yet beneath the surface, tension crackled like a summer storm. For 2 weeks the world's most powerful man would be brought low by a mysterious illness, and as his body weakened, the ambitions of those around him grew ever stronger. It began, as so many tragedies do, with a celebration. On the evening of May 29th, Alexander hosted a lavish banquet in honor of Narcus, his admiral and friend. The great hall was ablaze with torchlight, the tables groaning under the weight of roasted meats, honeyed cakes, and amphorae of wine imported from the vineyards of Greece. Musicians played lyres and flutes, their melodies weaving through the laughter and boasts of men who had marched to the ends of the earth. Alexander, resplendent in Persian robes and a golden diadem, moved among his guests with the easy confidence of a man who believed himself invincible. He toasted the gods, his companions, and the future. Always the future. Plans for a new campaign, this time against Arabia, were already being whispered. The world, it seemed, was not yet enough. But as the night wore on, a shadow passed over the festivities. Alexander, never one to shy from drink, raised his cup again and again. Some said he was in high spirits. Others, that he was restless, haunted by omens and dreams. As the final toasts were made, he suddenly cried out in pain, clutching his side. The music faltered. The laughter died. Was it the wine, the food, or something far more sinister? Over the next days, Alexander's condition worsened. Fever gripped him, burning away his strength. He shivered beneath silk sheets, his skin slick with sweat. His voice, once thunderous, grew hoarse and thin. The palace, once alive with celebration, became a place of whispers and hurried footsteps. Roxana, his young Persian queen, rarely left his side. She watched with wide, fearful eyes as the king's physicians, led by the loyal Philip of Acarnania, administered potions and poultices, their faces grave. They bled him, as was the custom, and offered prayers to Asclepius, the god of healing. But nothing seemed to help. Outside the royal chambers, the generals gathered in uneasy council. Ptolemy, Perdiccas, Seleucus, men who had followed Alexander from the dust of Macedon to the jungles of India, now eyed each other with suspicion. Who would lead if the king died? And always, the question lingered. what was killing Alexander. The accounts of those final days are as tangled as the streets of Babylon itself. Some said Alexander was struck down by a sudden fever, perhaps malaria or typhoid, brought on by the fetid waters of the Euphrates. Others whispered of poison, slipped into his wine by a jealous rival, or a vengeful Persian. The physician Philip, who had once saved Alexander's life on the battlefield, now found himself the subject of dark rumors. Had he betrayed his king, or was he powerless against a force beyond mortal understanding? Roxana, desperate and isolated in a foreign court, clung to hope. She sent for priests and magi, offering sacrifices to every god she knew, but the omens were grim. A flock of ravens fell dead at the palace gates. The temple of Bel, Babylon's chief deity, was struck by lightning. Even the river seemed to run sluggish and dark. Meanwhile, the generals circled like wolves. Antipater, the regent of Macedon, was far away, but his son Cassander had arrived in Babylon only weeks before. Some claimed he brought with him a poison, brewed by the philosopher Aristotle himself. Others pointed to the ambitious Perdiccas, who stood to gain most from Alexander's death. But the truth, if it existed, was lost in a fog of fear and ambition. As Alexander's illness dragged on, the palace became a fortress. Guards were posted at every door. Food and drink were tasted by slaves before reaching the king. The corridors echoed with the sound of armored boots and the low, urgent voices of men plotting their futures. Outside, the city of Babylon held its breath. Merchants and artisans, soldiers and slaves, all waited for news. Rumors spread like wildfire. The king was dead. The king was recovering. The king had been cursed by the gods. Each day the crowds gathered at the palace gates, straining for a glimpse of the man who had conquered the world. Inside, Alexander drifted in and out of consciousness. He called for his old friends Hephaestion, long dead, his mother Olympias, far away in Macedon. He spoke in riddles, recalling battles and prophecies, his mind wandering the vast distances he had once crossed with sword and shield. The physicians, helpless, could only watch as the king's life ebbed away. On the 8th day of his illness, Alexander could no longer speak. His generals, summoned to his bedside, filed past in silence. Some wept openly, others hid their tears behind stony faces. The king, once a force of nature, now seemed small and fragile, his breath shallow and ragged. It was said that he raised his hand in farewell, unable to utter a word. Some claimed he pressed his signet ring into the hand of Perdiccas, signalling his choice of successor. Others insisted he left no instructions, only a cryptic phrase, to the strongest. Outside, a storm gathered over Babylon. Thunder rolled across the plain, and the city's torches flickered in the wind. The world seemed to hold its breath. And then, on the evening of June 10th, Alexander the Great, king of Macedon, lord of Asia, pharaoh of Egypt, and would-be god, breathed his last. The news spread with terrifying speed. In the palace, Roxana collapsed in grief. The generals retreated to their quarters, each calculating his next move. The soldiers, many of whom had followed Alexander since boyhood, tore their clothes and wept in the streets. But even as the city mourned, the seeds of chaos were sown. With no clear air, the empire trembled on the edge of civil war. The body of the king, it was said, did not decay for days, a sign, some believed, of his divinity. Others saw it as proof of poison, a final insult to the man who had dared to call himself a god. In the shadows of Babylon, old alliances crumbled and new ones formed. The question of Alexander's death, its cause, its meaning, became a weapon in the hands of those who would shape the future. Was it fever, poison, or the wrath of the gods? The truth remains elusive, hidden behind the veils of time and ambition. The ancient sources contradict each other, each colored by the fears and desires of their authors. The physicians' notes are lost, the testimonies of the generals, suspect. But one thing is certain. In those final days, as the world's greatest conqueror lay dying, the fate of an empire and the course of history hung in the balance. The palace at Babylon, once a stage for triumph and celebration, became a crucible of suspicion and fear. The death of Alexander the Great sent shockwaves through the marble corridors and sun-baked courtyards. And as the city mourned, a darker question began to take root. Had the world's greatest conqueror truly fallen to illness, or had he been murdered? In the days that followed, the whispers grew louder. The air, already heavy with incense and the scent of wilting flowers, now carried the sharp tang of paranoia. Every glance, every hushed conversation, seemed to hint at secrets too dangerous to speak aloud. The generals, Those men who had marched with Alexander from the mountains of Macedon to the banks of the Indus eyed one another with a new wariness. Each had much to gain and much to lose. The theory of poison was not born in a vacuum. It was fed by the very nature of Alexander's court, a place where ambition and envy flourished side by side. The king's sudden illness, the way his body failed him so swiftly after the banquet, seemed to many too convenient, too well timed. Who in that glittering assembly might have slipped a fatal draught into his cup? Some pointed to Antipater, the regent of Macedon, a man whose power had grown in Alexander's absence. Antipater's relationship with the king had soured in recent years, and his son Casandor had arrived in Babylon not long before the fatal banquet. Casandor, with his cold eyes and calculating mind, was a man who inspired little trust among the old guard. Rumours swirled that he had brought with him a poison, a deadly concoction whispered to have been devised by none other than Aristotle, Alexander's former tutor. Could the philosopher who had once shaped the mind of a king have also played a role in his destruction? Others looked to Perdiccas, the ambitious general who had long coveted greater power. Perdiccas had been at Alexander's side during his final days, and some claimed he had been entrusted with the king's signet ring, a symbol of authority, or perhaps a mark of guilt. In the fevered imaginations of the court, every gesture, every word became a clue in a deadly game. Even Olympia's, Alexander's formidable mother, was not above suspicion. From her distant seat in Macedon, she had long manipulated the fates of kings and princes. Some believed she might have orchestrated her son's death to secure her own influence, or to avenge old slights. The web of intrigue stretched across continents, binding together the ambitions of men and women who had everything to gain from the fall of a god. Yet the evidence, such as it was, remained maddeningly elusive. Ancient sources, written years or even centuries after the fact, offered conflicting accounts. Some described a slow, agonizing decline, marked by fever and pain. Others insisted that Alexander's body showed no signs of decay for days after his death, a miracle, or a sign of a rare and potent poison. The testimonies of those who had been closest to the king were colored by their own ambitions and fears. The palace itself became a theater of suspicion. Servants were questioned, then silenced. Physicians were watched, their every move scrutinized. The kitchens, once filled with laughter and the clatter of feasts, now echoed with the nervous whispers of men who feared for their lives. Every cup of wine, every plate of food, was eyed with suspicion. But if Alexander had been murdered, who had the means and the opportunity? The banquet had been a crowded affair, with dozens of guests and servants moving in and out. The king's cupbearer, a trusted official, had tasted the wine before it reached Alexander's lips. The food had been prepared under the watchful eyes of the royal staff. Yet in a court where loyalty could be bought and fear was a constant companion, nothing was impossible. The question of motive was equally complex. Alexander's death left a power vacuum at the heart of the empire. With no clear heir, the generals and satraps began to maneuver for position, each seeking to carve out a kingdom of his own. The unity that Alexander had imposed through force of will began to unravel, and the spectre of civil war loomed over Babylon. For some, the king's death was a liberation. For others, it was a catastrophe. The men who had once sworn loyalty to Alexander now found themselves cast adrift, their futures uncertain. In the smoky halls of the palace, alliances were forged and broken in the space of a whispered conversation. The fate of the empire hung in the balance, and the question of who had killed Alexander became a weapon in the struggle for power. Outside the palace, the city of Babylon seethed with rumors. Merchants and soldiers, priests and beggars, all speculated on the cause of the king's death. Some spoke of a curse, a punishment from the gods for Alexander's hubris. Others insisted that the king had been betrayed by those he trusted most. The truth, if it existed, was buried beneath layers of fear and ambition. In the end, the mystery of Alexander's death became as much a part of his legend as his conquests. Theories multiplied, each more elaborate than the last. Some claimed he had been poisoned by water drawn from the river Styx, a mythical substance said to kill any mortal who drank it. Others believed he had been struck down by a rare disease, his body unable to bear the weight of his own ambition. Yet for all the speculation, the facts remained stubbornly out of reach. The ancient world had no forensic science, no way to test for toxins or trace the path of a disease. The accounts that survived were shaped by the politics of the men who wrote them, each seeking to justify his own actions or condemn his rivals. What is certain is that Alexander's death marked the end of an era. The empire he had built began to fracture almost at once, as his generals turned on one another in a brutal struggle for supremacy. The dream of a united world, ruled by a god-king, faded into memory, replaced by the harsh realities of ambition and betrayal. In the shadowed halls of Babylon, the question of who killed Alexander and why remained unanswered. The conqueror's body lay in state, a symbol of lost glory and unfulfilled promise. Around him, the men and women who had once shaped the fate of the world now plotted their own destinies, each haunted by the spectre of a king who had dared to reach for immortality. The story of Alexander's final days is a tapestry woven from ambition, fear, and the eternal mystery of power. In the end, perhaps it was not poison or disease that killed the king, but the very forces he had unleashed, the rivalries, the dreams, the insatiable hunger for greatness. The world he left behind would never be the same. Not all who watched Alexander's decline believed that human hands had brought about his end. In the ancient world, the line between the natural and the supernatural was thin, and the Greeks, Persians, and Babylonians alike saw omens in every shadow and heard the voices of gods in every wind. As the conqueror's body failed, many whispered that it was not poison, but the wrath of higher powers, or the workings of fate itself that had claimed him. The symptoms that overtook Alexander were as mysterious as they were relentless. Fever raged through his body, leaving him shivering and drenched in sweat, even as the Babylonian heat pressed in from the courtyards. His voice, once commanding and clear, faded to a hoarse whisper. He suffered pain in his abdomen, a burning thirst, and a growing weakness that no physician's remedy could touch. At times he drifted into delirium, speaking in riddles and recalling distant battles, as if his mind wandered the vast empire he had carved from the world. The palace physicians, led by Philip of Acarnania, did what they could. They bled him, as was the custom, and offered draughts of wine mixed with herbs. They called upon Asclepius, the god of healing, and made sacrifices at the altars, but nothing availed. The king's decline seemed inexorable, and the sense of helplessness grew with each passing day. Outside the sick room, the city of Babylon was alive with rumor. Some said Alexander had been cursed for his hubris, for daring to claim descent from Zeus and demanding divine honors. Others pointed to the omens that had haunted the court in the weeks before his illness. A lion cub born with two heads, the temple of Bel struck by lightning, a flock of ravens falling dead at the palace gates. Even the river Euphrates, lifeblood of the city, seemed to run sluggish and dark, as if mourning the fate of its conqueror. Priests and magi were summoned from every corner of the empire. They read the entrails of sacrificed animals, watched the flight of birds, and cast sacred lots. Their verdicts were grim. The gods, they said, were angry. Alexander had gone too far, crossed too many boundaries, defied too many traditions. He had burned the palace of Persepolis, desecrated ancient temples, and demanded that men bow before him as a living god. Such arrogance in the eyes of the divine could not go unpunished. Yet even as the priests spoke of curses and retribution, others sought more earthly explanations. The symptoms described in the ancient sources, fever, abdominal pain, delirium, have puzzled historians and doctors for centuries. Some have suggested malaria, a constant threat in the marshy lands around Babylon. Others point to typhoid fever, a disease that can strike suddenly and with deadly force, especially in the crowded, unsanitary conditions of a royal court. There are even more exotic theories. Some modern scholars have speculated that Alexander may have suffered from West Nile virus, brought by the migratory birds that filled the city's gardens and waterways. Others have suggested autoimmune disorders, or even a slow-acting poison that mimicked the symptoms of disease. The truth, shrouded by the passage of time and the biases of ancient chroniclers, remains elusive. But for those who watched Alexander's final days, the question was not merely medical. It was spiritual, existential. Could a man who had conquered the world, who had claimed the blood of gods, truly die like any other mortal? Or was his death a sign, a message from the heavens that no human, however great, could escape the limits of fate? As the king's condition worsened, the omens multiplied. The sky over Babylon darkened with sudden storms. The city's sacred animals grew restless, and the priests warned of disaster. In the palace, Roxana and the generals kept vigil, torn between hope and dread. Some prayed for a miracle, others prepared for the chaos that would follow the king's passing. In the ancient world, disease was not merely a matter of the body, but of the soul. Illness could be a punishment for impiety, a sign of divine displeasure, or the work of malevolent spirits. The rituals performed in Alexander's sick room were as much about appeasing the gods as about healing the patient. Incense burned day and night, filling the air with sweet smoke. Offerings of wine, honey, and precious oils were laid at the feet of statues. Chants and prayers echoed through the corridors, mingling with the king's fevered mutterings. Yet the gods remained silent. The fever did not break. The greatest physicians of the age could do nothing but watch as the conqueror slipped away. For the men and women of Babylon, Alexander's death was not just the end of a man, but the shattering of a world. The unity he had forged by force, by vision, by sheer will, began to unravel the moment his breath stilled. The omens that had haunted his final days now seemed to point the way to a future filled with uncertainty and strife. Was it truly the wrath of the gods that struck Alexander down, or was his death the inevitable price of greatness, the final act in a drama that had always been destined to end in tragedy? The ancient world offered no easy answers, only the enduring mystery of a king who had dared to challenge the heavens and paid the ultimate price. In the silence that followed, the city of Babylon mourned. The torches burned low in the palace. The river flowed on, indifferent to the fate of empires, and somewhere, in the darkness, the seeds of new legends began to take root, as men and women struggled to make sense of the fall of a god-king. The death of Alexander the Great was not a quiet passing, but a thunderclap that shattered the fragile unity of his empire. In the days and weeks that followed, Babylon became a city of mourning and maneuvering, its streets echoing with the wails of soldiers and the hurried footsteps of messengers. The conqueror's body, preserved in honey and guarded by his most loyal men, lay in state as the world he had built began to unravel. Within the palace, grief quickly gave way to calculation. The question on every tongue was the same: who would rule now? Alexander had left no clear heir. His only legitimate son, Alexander IV, was not yet born. Roxana, the Persian queen, was still heavy with child. His half-brother, Aridaeus, was of royal blood, but plagued by a mysterious mental affliction. The generals, the so-called successors, gathered in tense councils, each man weighing his own ambition against the uncertain future. The air in the palace was thick with suspicion. Old alliances were tested, and new ones forged in secret. Perdiccas, the commander of the companion cavalry, moved swiftly to secure the royal signet ring, a symbol of authority that many took as a claim to regency. Ptolemy, the shrewd and pragmatic general, watched and waited, already dreaming of Egypt. Seleucus, Antigonus, Lysimachus, each harbored his own designs, each measured the others with a wary eye. Outside, the Macedonian soldiers, those who had marched with Alexander from the plains of Macedon to the jungles of India, demanded a voice in the succession. They had bled for their king, and now they clamoured for a say in the fate of his empire. The Persians too watched with interest and unease, uncertain whether the new rulers would honour Alexander's vision of unity or return to the old ways of conquest and subjugation. The first great crisis came over the fate of Alexander's body. To the Macedonians, the burial of a king was a sacred duty, a matter of honour and legitimacy. Whoever controlled the body could claim the mantle of Alexander's legacy. Perdiccas, acting as regent, ordered that the body be sent to Macedon for burial in the royal tombs at Aegi. But Ptolemy, ever the opportunist, intercepted the funeral cortege and brought the body to Egypt, where he laid it to rest in a magnificent tomb in Alexandria. The theft of the king's remains was more than a personal affront. It was a declaration of independence, a signal that the empire would not remain whole for long. As the months passed, the unity Alexander had imposed by force of will began to fracture. The generals, now known as the Diadochi, divided the empire among themselves, each carving out a kingdom from the spoils of conquest. Wars erupted, first in whispers and assassinations, then in open battle. The dream of a single united empire faded into memory, replaced by a patchwork of rival states ruled by men who had once called themselves brothers in arms. Roxana, desperate to secure her son's inheritance, took refuge with the regent Perdiccas, but safety was an illusion. The royal women Roxana, Olympias and others became pawns in the deadly game of succession, their fates bound to the ambitions of men. The young Alexander IV, born into a world already tearing itself apart, would never know his father's glory or his peace. The soldiers, too, paid a heavy price. Many had hoped to return home, to see Macedon again after years of war. Instead, they found themselves drawn into new campaigns, fighting not for glory or empire, but for the ambitions of rival generals. The bonds of loyalty that had held Alexander's army together began to fray, replaced by suspicion and resentment. In the cities and provinces of the empire, the news of Alexander's death brought both hope and fear. Some saw a chance to throw off the yoke of Macedonian rule, to reclaim their independence. Others feared the chaos that would follow, the return of old enemies and the loss of the fragile peace Alexander had imposed. The world held its breath, waiting to see what new order would emerge from the ashes of the old. The mystery of Alexander's death became a weapon in the hands of the living. Each general spun his own version of events, casting blame on rivals and justifying his own actions. Was it poison, disease, or the will of the gods? The answer mattered less than the story, and the story was shaped by those who stood to gain. In the end, the empire that Alexander had built with blood and vision could not survive his passing. The unity he had dreamed of was undone by the very men who had helped him achieve it. The world he left behind was one of uncertainty and strife, a world haunted by the memory of a king who had dared to reach for immortality. In the shadow of his tomb, the struggle for power continued. The generals, the royal family, the soldiers, and the people, all were caught in the storm unleashed by the death of a god-king. The fate of the empire, and the legacy of Alexander, would be decided not by the will of one man, but by the ambitions and rivalries of many. And so, as the dust settled over Babylon and the fires of war spread across the ancient world, the legend of Alexander the Great entered a new and uncertain chapter, one written not in conquest, but in the struggle for his memory, his body, and his crown. Time did not heal the wound left by Alexander's death. Instead, it deepened the mystery and magnified his legend. In the years and centuries that followed, the story of the Conqueror's final days was retold and reshaped, each generation adding its own questions, suspicions, and dreams. The world had lost not just a king, but a living myth, a man who had seemed to stride the earth like a god, only to vanish in a feverish haze, leaving behind an empire in chaos, and a riddle that would never be solved. In the ancient world, the news of Alexander's death spread like wildfire, carried by messengers and merchants, soldiers and slaves. In the marketplaces of Athens, the temples of Egypt, and the distant courts of India, people asked the same questions. How could a man so young, so powerful, be struck down so suddenly? Was it the hand of an assassin, the bite of a fever, or the judgment of the gods? The uncertainty became a canvas for every hope and fear, every political ambition and personal grudge. Historians of the time, from the court chroniclers to the philosophers of distant lands, struggled to make sense of what had happened. Some, like the historian Clitarchus, painted a picture of palace intrigue and betrayal, hinting at poison and conspiracy. Others, like Ptolemy, one of Alexander's own generals, and later ruler of Egypt, downplayed the rumours, insisting on a natural death. The Roman historian Plutarch, writing centuries later, would gather these stories and contradictions, weaving them into a tapestry of legend and doubt. The mystery of Alexander's death became a mirror for the anxieties of the world he left behind. In the East, Persian and Egyptian traditions saw his passing as the inevitable fate of a mortal who had dared to challenge the gods. In the West, Greek philosophers debated the nature of greatness and the limits of human ambition. Was Alexander a hero, a tyrant, or something in between? Was his death a warning, or a tragedy, or both? As the centuries passed, the legend only grew. Medieval chroniclers in Europe and the Islamic world reimagined Alexander as a wise king, a seeker of truth, a prophet, even a saint. In the Persian epic Shahnameh, he became Iskandar, a world-conquering hero who sought the waters of immortality. In the Christian tradition, he was sometimes cast as a forerunner of Christ, sometimes as a cautionary tale of pride and downfall. Each culture, each era, found in Alexander's story a reflection of its own hopes and fears. Modern science has tried to pierce the veil of legend with the tools of medicine and forensics. Doctors have pored over the ancient accounts, searching for clues in the symptoms described by the chroniclers. Was it typhoid fever, as some suggest, or malaria, or West Nile virus? Could it have been an autoimmune disorder, or a slow-acting poison? The evidence is tantalizing, but always incomplete. The ancient world left no autopsy, no preserved remains, only the words of men who had their own reasons to shape the story. Yet perhaps the greatest mystery is not how Alexander died, but why his death still haunts us. What is it about this young king, gone at the height of his power, that continues to fascinate and unsettle? Is it the scale of his ambition, the audacity of his dreams, the sheer improbability of his rise? Or is it the sense of unfinished business, the feeling that the world he left behind was forever changed, but never truly completed? In the end, Alexander's last breath became more than a moment in history. It became a symbol, a reminder of the fragility of greatness, the unpredictability of fate, and the enduring power of human imagination. His empire crumbled, his generals fought and died, his body was lost to time, but his story lived on, echoing through the ages, inviting each new generation to ask, what really happened in Babylon? What secrets did the Conqueror take to his grave? The world may never know the answer, But as long as there are those who wonder, who question, who seek to understand the mysteries of the past, the legend of Alexander the Great will never truly die. His last breath, shrouded in shadow and silence, continues to stir the imagination, a riddle whispered across the centuries, waiting for someone, somewhere, to solve it. Even as the centuries rolled on, the enigma of Alexander's death refused to fade. His story, like the shifting sands of the deserts he once crossed, was reshaped by every age that we told it. In the ancient libraries of Alexandria, in the candlelit scriptoria of medieval Europe, and in the bustling universities of the modern world, scholars and dreamers alike pored over the fragments of his life, searching for meaning in the silence that followed his final breath. The ancient sources themselves are a labyrinth. Arrian, writing with the discipline of a soldier, tried to sift fact from rumour, yet even he could not escape the shadows that clung to Alexander's end. Plutarch, ever the philosopher, saw in the king's death a lesson about the dangers of pride and the limits of human achievement. Diodorus, Justin, and Curtius Rufus each offered their own versions, coloured by the politics and passions of their times. The truth, if it ever existed, was already slipping away, lost in the tangle of memory and myth. In the centuries after his death, Alexander's image was claimed by many. To the Romans, he was the ultimate conqueror, a model for their own Caesars. To the Persians, he was both destroyer and lawgiver, a figure woven into their epic poetry. In the Islamic world, he became Dhul Qarnayn, the two-horned one, a wise and just ruler who travelled to the ends of the earth. Each tradition, each storyteller, found something different in the life and the death of the Macedonian king. But the mystery of his demise was never just a question for historians. It became a touchstone for artists, poets, and philosophers. In the Renaissance, painters imagined the moment of his passing, surrounding the dying king with grieving generals and anxious courtiers. In the Enlightenment, thinkers debated whether his death was a warning against unchecked ambition or a tragedy born of human frailty. Even today, the story of Alexander's last days inspires novels, films, and endless speculation. What is it about this moment, this sudden, inexplicable end, that so captivates the imagination? Perhaps it is the sense of unfinished destiny. Alexander had stood on the threshold of new worlds, his gaze fixed on Arabia, the distant lands beyond the horizon. His plans, his dreams, were cut short in a single, fevered fortnight. The empire he built was left without a master, its future uncertain, its unity shattered. The world he had tried to bind together unravelled almost overnight. Or perhaps it is the very ambiguity of his death that draws us in. The ancient world was a place of secrets and shadows, where poison and prophecy, disease and divine wrath, all seemed equally plausible. The lack of certainty invites us to imagine, to question, to fill the silence with our own stories. Was Alexander murdered by those he trusted most? Did he fall victim to a nameless illness, a curse, or his own relentless drive? Each theory is a mirror, reflecting the fears and hopes of those who propose it. Yet, for all the speculation, the heart of the mystery remains untouched. The Conqueror, who had never lost a battle, was finally defeated by something unseen, something that no sword or strategy could overcome. His death, like his life, became a legend, a story that belongs not just to history, but to the realm of myth. In the end, Alexander's last breath is more than a historical puzzle. It is a reminder of the limits of power, the fragility of human life, and the enduring allure of the unknown. His empire crumbled, his generals turned against one another, and the world he had shaped was forever changed. But the question of his death, its cause, its meaning remains, echoing through the ages. As long as there are those who seek answers in the shadows of the past, the mystery of Alexander's end will endure. It is a story that invites us to look beyond the facts, to wonder at the forces that shape the fate of nations and the lives of extraordinary individuals. In the silence that followed his passing, a new kind of legend was born, one that asks not just how a king died, but why his story still matters. And so the world remembers Alexander not only for the lands he conquered, but for the riddle he left behind, a riddle that even now refuses to be solved. The legend of Alexander's final days lingers, not only in the annals of history but in the very questions that echo through time. His death, shrouded in uncertainty, became a touchstone for every age that followed, a story retold in marble and ink, in whispered tales around campfires, in the dreams of those who yearned for greatness or feared its cost. In the centuries after his passing, the world he had conquered was transformed. The empire he forged in a blaze of ambition splintered into rival kingdoms, each ruled by one of his former companions. The Diadochi, once brothers in arms, became bitter enemies, their wars redrawing the map of the ancient world. The cities Alexander had founded, Alexandria in Egypt, Bucephala in India, dozens more became crossroads of culture, where Greek, Persian, Egyptian and Indian traditions mingled and clashed. His vision of a united world faded, but the seeds of Hellenistic civilization took root, blossoming into an era of art, science, and philosophy that would shape the course of history. Yet even as his legacy endured, the mystery of his death refused to be laid to rest. In every generation, new voices joined the chorus of speculation. Some saw in his end a warning against the dangers of unchecked ambition, a lesson written in the fevered decline of a man who had dared to call himself divine. Others found inspiration in his relentless drive, his refusal to accept the limits of the possible. For poets and philosophers, Alexander's last breath became a symbol of the eternal struggle between fate and free will, between the dreams of mortals and the designs of the gods. The search for answers continued. Archaeologists scoured the ruins of Babylon, hoping to find some trace of the king's final days. Medical experts debated the symptoms described in ancient texts, weighing the likelihood of poison, disease, or something stranger still. Historians sifted through the conflicting accounts, each new theory adding another layer to the legend. The tomb of Alexander, once said to be the marvel of Alexandria, vanished into the mists of time, its location lost, its secrets buried with the man himself. But perhaps the true power of Alexander's story lies not in the solution to the mystery, but in the questions it leaves behind. What does it mean to chase greatness? To stand at the edge of the known world and dream of more? What price must be paid for ambition? And who bears the cost when a single life shapes the fate of millions? In the silence that followed Alexander's last breath, these questions took root, growing into the myths and memories that have haunted humanity ever since. The world that Alexander left behind was forever changed. His name became a byword for conquest and glory, his image carved into stone and stamped on coins from Egypt to India. Yet the man himself remains elusive, his final moments obscured by the passage of time and the fog of legend. The conqueror, who had seemed invincible, who had bent the world to his will, was ultimately undone by forces no one could see or understand. And so the story endures, a tale of ambition and mystery, of triumph and tragedy, of a king who reached for the heavens and vanished into history's shadows. The riddle of Alexander's death remains unsolved, a whisper on the wind, a challenge to all who seek to understand the past. As long as there are those who wonder, who question, who search for meaning in the stories of those who came before, the legend of Alexander's last breath will never truly fade. It is a mystery that belongs to all of us, a reminder that even the greatest among us are, in the end, only human, and that the stories we leave behind are as enduring and as enigmatic as the stars themselves.